Greetings, class. Chapter 24 was based on the Aztec Empire. The introduction to that chapter 24, section 1, is basically talking about the fact that they were originally a nomadic people, hunter-gatherers, meaning that they hunted for food, clothing, etc., and picked berries and stuff like that to eat. Many different groups in the Mexico Valley originally kicked them out because they saw them as barbaric people. They were really good at fighting, but at the time, not a whole lot else. They had a legend about an eagle with a snake in its mouth that would be perched upon a cactus, that when they saw it, it was their symbol that they had found their homeland, their new homeland. So when they eventually found an eagle with the snake in its mouth, they decided to settle on that island, and it eventually turned into a great empire. The name of the city that they built was Tenochtitlan, which means fruit of the prickly peared cactus. Chapter 24, section 2 is all about the Aztecs in the Mexico Valley. So when they arrived in Central Valley of Mexico, they became wandering nomads. They had left their homeland. And like I said before, people kept kicking them out because they saw them as barbarians. Prior to their arrival, however, there was two different groups. It's important to know which those two groups were. I'll let you look that up, which the Aztecs actually revered both of them, primarily the second one, basing much of their culture off of it. And in fact, even later on, one of the Aztec rulers burned most of their history and stated that they essentially came from the second latter group of people. The Aztecs were originally called the Mexicas. They weren't called the Aztecs, but at least that's not what they called themselves. That name came later on. They primarily found work as mercenaries because they were good soldiers, and warriors as a people. They would loan out those services for money. They didn't really have a place to call home. They eventually, however, were kicked out of the central part of the Mexico Valley by a stronger force and forced to move south in the Mexican Valley. They then partnered with a city-state called Clohucan. They served them as mercenaries until eventually the partnership was ended because they sacrificed the chief's daughter, which, as you could probably imagine, didn't go over too well with those people. So again, they had to leave. They headed to the Texcoco River, where their legend was finally fulfilled when they found an island that was essentially surrounded by a lot of swampy islands and stuff. However, it was a place that was easily defended, and they had plentiful resources, things like water and fish and animals to hunt and stuff like that. Over the next course of 100 years, they worked under another city-state that was in the local area that basically held the power there. However, they were heavy-handed, meaning that they were kind of harsh rulers, and so they formed what was called a triple alliance with two other city-states in the area, and was able to overthrow the harsh ruler. At that time, the Aztec Empire kind of started to form. So the way that they were able to make this uninhabitable place habitable was through a process called terraforming, which actually you won't find in the book, but it does describe, in essence, what terraforming is, which is changing the land to make it habitable to live on. And the way that they did this was they built floating gardens, they built causeways and dikes to hold back water, things like that. They had a plaza at the center of their city, which was 150 feet high. At the top was used for religious ritual. There's two buildings to it. One was for their chief god, who they believed required sacrifice and blood to survive. And the other one was for the rain god. So they also had in this plaza a place for ritual sacrifice. At the time, their population was between 200 to 300,000 people. When the Spaniards first arrived, they marveled at the vastness and the advancedness of the Aztec Empire because it was even cleaner and nicer, essentially, than many of the European and Eastern places in the world, and larger as well. So in 24, section 4, it talks about the spread of the Aztec Empire. So it really first became an empire because of the demand, because there was so many people living in the capital city, and because they were great warriors, they essentially conquered other people. However, unlike most of the Eastern people coming over from Europe, they didn't make colonies. Instead, they took a lot of people to sacrifice to their chief god as tribute. They trained every one of their own males to be warriors. So essentially, most places would have a large group of warriors descending upon their city if they refused to be part of the Aztec Empire. And so that was pretty much the warfare. And usually it would be over after one battle and wouldn't take longer than a day because the Aztecs were such good soldiers and they could pretty much overwhelm just about anybody. This caused their population to grow even more as each city-state that they conquered would have to then pay tribute as well. They would leave their leader in place usually, and they could still worship any other god they wanted. They just essentially had to honor the chief god and pay tribute, which it didn't have to necessarily be money. It could really be anything that they had that was valuable, such as jade or gold or like maize or food or clothing, stuff like that, or even slaves. Whatever they had that was valuable. So eventually the Aztec Empire spanned for the majority of what's now Mexico, all the way down to the Guatemalan border, and from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. So, in a nutshell, that is all about the Aztec Empire from chapter 24. The summary, which is section 5, is that essentially, to sum everything up, is that they went from hunter-gatherers and mercenaries to, in 1325, they began originally building their capital city of Tenochtitlan, but they didn't really begin to emerge as a legitimate city-state until after defeating the Tepenecs in rebellion, in the Triple Alliance rebellion. They had rapid growth through warfare and ended up using a lot of the captives that they brought. Some would turn into slaves, but most would be sacrifices as tribute. It's also important to know that they had other things like their sports arena and like the types of things that they would trade and the types of goods that they lived on, stuff like that. But other than that, that is pretty much the Aztec culture from chapter 24.